Walk through the forest in upstate New York or outside of Philadelphia or along the cliffs of Rhode Island, and you will find them. They are the rotting skeletons of American royalty. Massive stone arches overtaken by vines. Ballrooms where the roof has collapsed, letting the rain wash away the remaining gold leaf. Staircases that once welcomed presidents and kings, now leading to nowhere. When we see these ruins, we tell ourselves a comforting lie. We say, the family must have made bad investments. We assume they gambled it away, or the depression swallowed them whole, or the heirs were just lazy and incompetent. We like that story because it feels fair. If you are stupid with money, you lose it. But that is not what happened here. These houses weren't abandoned because of bad luck. They were murdered. They were targeted by a specific weapon, designed in a specific year, with the sole purpose of severing the link between a father and his son. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a market crash. It was a single piece of legislation passed in 1916. This is the story of the law that killed the Gilded Age. This is how the system decided that your legacy doesn't belong to your children. It belongs to the state. To understand the magnitude of this destruction, you first have to understand the world that was destroyed. Before 1916, America operated on a completely different set of physics. If you were a titan of industry, a Rockefeller, a Carnegie, a Vanderbilt, you were building something designed to last for 1,000 years. The mindset of the Gilded Age wasn't just about being rich. It was about dynasty. When you built a mansion like Whitemarsh Hall or the Breakers, you weren't building a house. You were building a monument. You were carving your name into the bedrock of history. These structures required hundreds of staff to maintain. They held art collections that rivaled the Louvre. They were physical manifestations of the idea that wealth could be permanent. And for a long time, it was. There was no income tax. There was no mechanism for the government to reach into your pocket and take what you had earned. If you made $1 million in 1890, you kept $1 million. If you died, your son got $1 million. The transfer of power was seamless. It was absolute. This terrified the political class. By the early 20th century, the gap between the rich and the poor was widening. The robber barons held more power than the government itself. J.P. Morgan single-handedly bailed out the U.S. government during the Panic of 1907. Think about that. A private citizen had to save the treasury. The politicians in Washington realized a terrifying truth. If they didn't break these fortunes, these families would eventually become more powerful than the state. They needed a way to shatter these dynasties. They couldn't just confiscate the money while the tycoons were alive. That would cause a revolution. They had to wait for the one moment when the tycoon couldn't fight back. They had to wait until he died. The weapon they chose was the estate tax. Now, taxes are boring. But what happened in 1916 wasn't boring. It was a guillotine. In 1916, the Revenue Act was passed. Initially, the rate seemed modest. It started at a 10% tax on the transfer of the net estate. The rich didn't panic immediately. They thought it was a temporary measure to fund the looming war in Europe. They thought they could account for 10%. But the system never retreats. Once the door was cracked open, the government kicked it down. Within just a few years, the rates began to climb. And climb. By the time the Great Depression hit and World War II followed, the top estate tax rate hit an astronomical 77%. Let that sink in for a second. 77%. Imagine you spend your entire life building a business. You sacrifice your time, your health, and your relationships to build an empire worth $100 million in today's money. You build a massive estate to house your family for generations. You die, thinking you have secured their future. But before your body is even cold, the government steps in and demands $77 million. And here is the trap. Here is the specific mechanic that turned mansions into ruins. Wealthy people are rarely cash-rich. Their wealth isn't sitting in a checking account. Their wealth is trapped in illiquid assets. It's in the land. It's in the factories. It's in the art on the walls. It's in the mansion itself. When the government demands a 77% tax payment, they don't want a painting. They don't want a wing of the house. They want cash. Immediate, cold, hard cash. So what does the heir do? They have inherited a $10 million house, but they owe the government millions in taxes. They have no choice. They have to liquidate. This is the fire sale of the American aristocracy. Suddenly, the The market was flooded. You had heirs to massive fortunes frantically trying to sell everything not bolted down just to pay the tax bill. But because everyone was selling at the same time, the prices crashed. Priceless European tapestries were sold for scraps. Old masters' paintings were auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. The furniture, the silver, the jewelry, it was all churned through the system to generate cash to feed the government beast. But the biggest casualty was the real estate. You see, a 100-room mansion is a terrible asset if you don't have the money to run it. It requires coal for heating, gardeners for the grounds, maids for the rooms. It is a cash-eating monster. Before 1916, the endowment left by the patriarch would pay for this upkeep. But the estate tax had eaten the endowment. The heirs were left with the massive house, but the fuel to run the house, the cash, had been confiscated by Washington. They couldn't afford to live there. But here is the tragic twist. They couldn't sell them either. Who buys a 110-room castle during the Depression? Who buys a Gilded Age monument when the tax rates are 77%? No one. There were no buyers. So, the heirs were faced with an impossible choice. They couldn't live in the house. They couldn't sell the house. But as long as the house stood, they had to pay property taxes on it. The house became a parasite. This leads us to one of the most heartbreaking phenomena of the 20th century, the deliberate destruction of beauty. Across the country, heirs began to unroof their own mansions. They would hire crews to come in and tear the roofs off their ancestral homes. Why? Because in many jurisdictions, if a building has no roof, it is considered a ruin rather than a residence, and the property taxes drop significantly. They literally bombed their own legacy to save themselves from the tax collector. Look at Whitemarsh Hall in Pennsylvania. It was the Versailles of America, one of the largest private residences ever built in the United States. It had 147 rooms. It hosted the sheer peak of American culture. After the original owner died and the taxes took their toll, the house sat empty. It couldn't be sold. It decayed. Vandals moved in. The gardens, which were once manicured by dozens of staff, were reclaimed by the forest. Finally, in 1980, it was demolished to make room for a housing development of townhomes. The legacy was erased. The system won. This wasn't an accident. This was the intended result of the 1916 shift. The goal was to prevent the formation of an American aristocracy, and in that sense, it worked flawlessly. It democratized destruction. But the story doesn't end in the 1940s. The echo of that law is still vibrating today. You might be sitting there thinking, well, I don't have a 100-room mansion, so this doesn't apply to me. This is a rich person problem. That is exactly what they want you to think. The system always starts at the top. It targets the villains, the robber barons, the ultra-wealthy, because no one sympathizes with them. It's easy to sell a tax on the rich. It feels like justice. But once the machinery is in place, it never stays at the top. It always creeps down. Consider the concept of the family farm or the small business. The estate tax, often called the death tax, hits them even harder than it hits the billionaires. A billionaire has armies of lawyers. They use trusts, offshore accounts, and charitable foundations to shield their money. The Rockefellers are still rich. The very people the law was supposed to break learned how to navigate the maze. They bought the politicians who wrote the laws. But the successful farmer? The guy who owns a small manufacturing plant? The family who owns a few rental properties? They are asset-rich and cash-poor, just like the Vanderbilts of the 1920s. When the patriarch dies, the farm is worth $15 million on paper because of land values. The IRS wants their cut. The family doesn't have $6 million in cash. So what happens? They sell the farm. They sell the business, usually to a massive conglomerate. The 1916 law didn't just kill mansions, it killed independence. It fueled the consolidation of corporate America. It ensured that independent wealth is constantly pruned back, preventing anyone outside the inner circle from establishing a permanent foothold. This brings us back to those ruins in the woods. When you look at footage of an abandoned mansion, don't just see broken glass and graffiti. Don't just see a spooky location for a ghost hunt. Look closer. Look at the craftsmanship of the molding. Look at the ambition of the architecture. That was the physical proof that a family once tried to build something that would outlast them. They tried to create a safe haven for their bloodline. And the system said, No. The 1916 estate tax fundamentally changed the psychology of money in America. It taught us that we don't really own anything. We are just renting our assets from the government, and the final rent payment is due the moment we die. It changed how the wealthy spend money. Why build a beautiful, lasting monument if it's just going to be seized? Why invest in 500-year architecture? It's better to spend it all now. It's better to buy things that can be hidden, moved, or consumed. The era of the great American estate died because the math no longer worked. We traded beauty for bureaucracy. We traded legacy for liquidity. So, the next time you see a video of an urban explorer walking through a crumbling ballroom, remember the date, 1916. That was the year the door closed. That was the year the government decided that the transfer of wealth was a privilege, not a right. And the vines crawling up those walls. They aren't just nature reclaiming the land. They are the receipt. They are the physical evidence of a transaction where a family traded their past to pay for a government that has long since spent the money. The mansions are empty because the system is full. And if you think you are safe because you aren't a Vanderbilt, look at your own assets. Look at inflation. Look at how the thresholds change. The line of what constitutes rich is always moving, but the appetite of the system remains the same. Those ruins are a warning. They are a monument to the fact that in the end, the White House, always wins.